So, you clicked on this video because you want to know what dungeon class to play. Well, I'm going to help you out. In this video, I'm going to be going through the advantages and disadvantages of each class, and I'm going to break down which class you should play. The qualities that would make up a good class would be things like how expensive it is, how versatile the class is, and also how easy it is to get into dungeon parties and things like that, and they're all going to contribute to how good the class is overall. Each class has the pros and cons, with one class in particular maybe having more disadvantages than the rest. But before we get into the video, I kindly ask you to like the video and maybe even subscribe if you haven't. And also, make sure to join my Discord because I do lots of giveaways in there, and it's also just a great place to hang out with people who play Skyblock. Sorry I couldn't record Dungeons gameplay for this. Dungeons was closed at the time. So, starting off with the healer class. Healer is So I'm just going to give an analogy here. Imagine you have 3 children. You have the oldest one, you have the youngest one, and you have the middle child. And healer's basically the middle child. No one cares about them, the admins don't pay any respect to it, and also, they serve no purpose. And that's basically what healer is. Despite the overwhelming negatives, I'm still going to go over some of the positives that a healer class has. Firstly, healer class is actually not too bad in the earlier stages of dungeons. This is because 90% of the time you're going to be using Party Finder, and with that you're going to be finding a lot of monkeys, which means that you're probably going to be end up with an average of about 13 deaths per run. With this in mind, it can actually be useful as a healer because you just revive everyone, and without a healer to revive everyone, you may actually end up failing the run. This is why healer can actually be viable in the lower floors of the catacombs. Another thing which can be quite useful is that the healer class is generally used to support the tank, and if the tank has trouble surviving, then it's the healer's job to try and keep them alive, and the abilities like Wish and Healing Cycle can actually help quite a lot, and especially if they have a Reaper Mask. The last thing I want to mention why healer can sometimes be actually viable is also in the latter stages of Master Mode. You may think that why would you want a healer in the end stages of Master Mode? However, quite often, as a team, you want to avoid any dupes. So often, you just have to fill healer because that's the only space left, and otherwise you'd be creating dupes. Alright, so now we move on to the disadvantage of healer. So, where do I start? The worst things about healer class is a combination of 2 things. The first is that it's completely overshadowed by tank class and all the other classes, because tank is just way better for support, and if you have a tank, there's just no reason to have a healer unless in really specific circumstances. This leads me on to my second point, which is that healer class is so hard to get into parties, because no one wants healer, because if you have a good tank, there's no purpose for healer, and the spot which you're healing people is much better used by just having a damage class like Mage or Burz, or even Archer if you don't have one. This means that a lot of the time, you literally just get insta-kicked if you join as a healer, and even if people don't take a second to look at your gear, you'll just get insta-kicked for the fact it just says healer next to your name. The third glaring downside I have with healer is the fact it's so hard to build your class milestones. With the other classes, it's really easy to get milestone 9, and dealing outrageous amounts of damage or just tanking loads of damage is really not hard at all, as long as you have good gear and you're in the right floor. This is why, when you're playing healer, a lot of the times you literally just have to go to trap room, stand in the flamethrower, and just activate your healing circle to try and build up your milestone, which just wastes so much time in the run, and it's just so annoying. And you have to do this to get your class XP, dungeon XP, and also the rewards chest at the end. Moving on to Mage, Mage is significantly better than healer, and is also very different because it's a DPS class unlike healer, which is a support class. Firstly, Mage is probably the best class for clearing. This is because the Mage weapons are completely designed to just deal loads and loads of AoE damage, just enough so you can one-tap the mobs in the room, and things like the Spirit Scepter and the Hyperion are both the best weapons for these kind of clearing. This means it's the most efficient class when you're clearing dungeons, and it's the best when you're trying to maximise efficiency for getting to the boss. The second quite good thing about Mage is that the progression in terms of weapons and armour is actually quite gradual and is quite good, up until about floor 6. This is because you have loads of weapons like Dreadlord Sword, Bonzo Staff, Frozen Scythe, and Spirit Scepter, and until you get to Hyperion, These is all quite gradual progression, only about like 3 million coins difference between all of them. Of course, that is until you get to the Hyperion, which is, as we know, about 1.1 billion coins. The third advantage of Mage is that it actually can be quite cheap, because the armor is not overly expensive because Storm armor is not actually too bad. And until you get Hyperion, all you really need is like Storm and then like a Spirit Scepter to be good, and that's really not that expensive, especially if you're also using something like a Sheep Pet. The final advantage I'm going to talk about for Mage is that for Master Mode, LCM, which is the using Mage Beam, is actually very good. However, this only really works at high catacombs levels. Moving on to the disadvantages, as I just mentioned LCM is extremely expensive. When you play LCM, you also need to have 2 Storm sets, one with Necrotic and then also one with Ancient to maximize your damage. Playing LCM and RCM is basically like having 2 classes, and you just have to pay for 2 classes, which is just really expensive. The second disadvantage I'm going to talk about, which is somewhat similar to the price margin, is that for F7, and Mage is probably the best class for F7, it's completely item gated by Hyperion. To do F7 and to be able to get into good F7 parties, you have to have a Hyperion, because it just doesn't really make the cut with a Yeti sword or a Spirit Scepter. The final thing I want to mention is that Mage is actually really squishy, and quite often you definitely need a tank. You really don't have a lot of EHP, and you're much more likely to die in the clear and also the boss than if you're playing something like Berserker or Archer. And with the disadvantages out the way, let's move on to the Berserker. Berserker is probably the class that I've had most experience in, and it's also my highest class level. The first advantage of Berserker compared to other classes is that it's decently cheap, because you can sort of get away with using something like a Flower of Truth and Shadow Assassin, actually quite a high floor. And especially when you get into things like Master Mode, it's much cheaper than something like Tank or Mage. And it's also not item gated like something like Mage, where you need to have a Hyperion to be effective in F7. This leads me on to my second point, is that the Berserker weapon progression is actually really good. This is because early game you have things like the Flower of Truth, which doesn't have any requirements, which is very good, and you can work your way up with things like a Livid Dagger, Shadow Fury, Juju Shortbow, and then later on you can get Axe of the Shredded, Giant Sword, and Terminator. This is a lot more gentle than something like Mage, where Mage you have like a Spirit Scepter which is like 15 mil, and you jump straight away to Hyperion with like a 1.1 billion. The armor progression for Berserker is also decent as well, because you can just upgrade from Shadow Assassin to Necron armor, and you can also use a Zombie Knight chestplate if you have it as well. The third advantage is maybe slightly less, but I think it's still worth mentioning, is that it can actually be good for avoiding dupes, especially in Archer, because there's always going to be lots of debate about who gets solo Arch because they have a high Archer level or something, and quite often, people often just go Berserker to avoid having a dupe Archer in their team. Moving on to the disadvantages, a glaring disadvantage for me is that as a Berserker, it's really hard to get into F7 parties. If you're something like a tank or mage, it's really easy to get into F7 as long as you have a Hyperion. And you can essentially just walk into any party and you'll pretty much be accepted as long as your cast level is not completely abysmal. Quite often, you find that literally just no one lets Berserkers in because they just want things like mages with Hyperions. My final point that I want to make is that Berserker, compared to like Mage and Archer, actually does a lot less damage in them. The damage compared to Archer is way less because Archer just is overpowered in terms of damage, and also it's nowhere near as good as Mage for clearing. And now we move on to Archer. Archer's a bit of a weird class because sometimes it's been the most overpowered thing in existence with like boomerangs, then also it's literally just been like the worst class because there's just no good weapons. But now with the introduction of the short bows, they're now the best class for damage in dungeons. This leads me to my first advantage, which is the fact that Archer has the best damage and it's also really good for clearing because of things like bouncy arrows and the fact that the arrows like travel to all the mobs in the room. The items like the Terminator and Necron armor and like Ender Dragon, all of this combined with the Archer class bonuses provide the best damage and it's just really overpowered. Therefore, this also means that Archer is probably the best class for Master Mode in terms of damage, and is probably the most important class in terms of trying to deal as much damage as possible. And having a good Archer in your team is very important. However, despite all of these overwhelming positives, there there are a lot of big negatives that you have to get around. Firstly, the main thing I want to say is that it's so hard to get into parties in things like Party Finder. This is because Archer is such good damage and also really good for clearing and the best class. There are so many people who want to play Archer, and this just leads to there being so many archers around, and in general dungeons just being oversaturated with archers. This means that if you're one-tricking Archer, it's going to be really hard to try and find parties. And if you want to be like that, you have to be the best at archers in order to get into parties. This for me is enough to not play Archer, and it's the main reason I actually played Berserker for most of the time. I'll usually play Berserker, but if there's no one playing Archer, then I'll just switch to Archer, because it's just better than Berserker when you're playing solo. The second thing I want to mention is that it's actually really item gated. Archer is pretty terrible until you get a Juju Shortbow, and then the later ends of Master Mode, you need to have a Terminator to become effective. In general, the progression for weapons is really limited, because you just have a Juju Shortbow, which is probably around 40 million coins for a good one, and then you jump straight to a Terminator, which is like 620 million coins, and there's really no in between about this. Overall, Archer, very good damage, best class Master Mode, but it's so hard to get into parties. And with that said, let's move on to the final class, Tank. Tank class, like Archer, has also had its major ups and downs, with before the tank change being a relatively non-existent class, but afterwards pretty much the most essential class. The first advantage, as a tank, it's way easier to get into a party than something like Berserker or Archer. This is because every party above like something like floor 5 needs one, and there's not really that many tanks around, meaning that if you're a good tank and there's no tank already in the party, you're pretty much guaranteed a spot. And I think this is pretty much the biggest reason why people play tank, because it's so easy to get into parties, and also when you're finding things like perms, it's a lot easier as well. So, now we move on to the cons of tank. The first downside for me is that although having just a pure tank set is actually quite cheap, because you only need to have, the weapon doesn't really matter, it's just the armor. When you get into the later stages of Master Mode, and probably early floors of Master Mode as well, you need to have another set for like clearing the dungeon, and usually this will be in floor 7, like a Hype, but in Master Mode, you'll usually have a Juju Shortbow or a Terminator. This is a bit like the situation with the RCM and LCM, where you essentially just have to buy two completely different sets for the same class, and it's the same in tank, because you have to buy like a damage set, and you also have to buy a pure tank set, and this is probably the reason why it's probably the most expensive class. Apart from the fact it's actually quite expensive, there's not many other downsides. However, I do want to mention one more thing. As a tank, especially in F7, the whole team relies on you, so if you mess up, like you die or you disconnect or something, then you've essentially just thrown the run for your whole party, and the run is basically just undoable. And this is also why, if you're a tank in F7 and you're in Party Finder, and you accidentally kill yourself in up crushing or something, I don't know, then everyone is going to get really mad at you, and I just want to warn you before playing tank. If you're a good tank and you know what you're doing, then it's completely fine. But if you're struggling a bit and you're just learning the ropes of F7, yeah, you're going to get shouted at a lot. And with the end of the tank, I'm just going to give a quick summary on what I thought. For the damage classes, Mage is the best for clearing, although in later modes of Master Mode, it's going to get really expensive. Archer is the best for class for damage, but it's really oversaturated, so you're going to struggle to get in a lot of parties. And this is where Berserk comes in, because it doesn't do nearly as much damage, but at least you won't have to fight as hard to get into parties. And for the support classes, well, healer, yeah, we don't really talk about that. But yeah, I guess tank is pretty good. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful at all, then please consider leaving a like, and if you're extra cool, then please subscribe as well. Anyways, thank you for watching, and good luck with your dungeon journeys and picking what class you want to play.